Good morning. Welcome to Coffee Talk. Looking for my coffee. Happy Monday. Welcome to another episode of my awesome talk show, Coffee Talk Live. This is a show where my guests and I explore what it looks like to live a sustainably healthy lifestyle as women, as mothers, in the home and in the community. I'm your host, Connie Pastorius, founder of Pastorius Fitness and the creator of the Strong as a Mother coaching program, which is for moms who are ready to regain control of their lives and reclaim their health. I'm also the founder and woman in charge here of the Strong as a Mother Happy and Healthy Living community, which is a Facebook group for moms that sets the standard for what online fitness and nutrition support for women should be. No fad diets, no MLM, no BS. So do me a favor, drop a 1 in the comments if you're watching live with us today, and a 2 if you're catching the replay. Either way, don't be shy. I want to hear your voice in this conversation. So if you're watching later or on YouTube, click the link in the description of the video to join Strong as a Mother, an awesome community of busy moms just like you. Now, let's get to why we're here hanging out on a beautiful Monday morning. I am so excited for you guys to meet today's guest because honestly, she is one of the people I admire most in the world. Not just for her career and what she's dedicated her life to, but she's also an incredibly amazing mom to the sweetest 2 babies that I've met besides my own daughter. So my guest today is a licensed social worker and a certified ADHD clinical specialist. And she just so happens to also be my cousin. So without further ado, please welcome to the show, Emily Harpsting. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, cuz, it's so good to see you.
It is. I feel like I'm going to have to really focus hard on, okay, what are we supposed to talk about today?
I got notes. I got you. Oh, yeah, we were already starting to go off on other conversations. So anyone who's watching, Emily and I are the same age for half of the year. We grew up far apart, but she was in Mississippi when I was in Pittsburgh, then she was in Ohio, but we still maintain this awesome relationship. And I feel like whenever we start talking again, we never skip a beat. We just pick right back up.
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on and pretty amazing too.
Yeah. And somehow we both ended up in this really awesome space in our careers where I think our skills complement each other really well. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I feel like we've bounced stuff off each other in that way before too.
Yeah. So I really want to get to the topic of today's conversation, but before we do, I always ask, what's in your cup today?
Yeah, there's Dr. Pepper this morning. I couldn't get moving. I just needed that caffeine sugar jolt in the morning, and that's just where it was at. As you can tell, no makeup this morning, pulled my hair up. That's just where it's at today.
You are authentic today.
That I am definitely authentic today.
So I'm having my standard coffee. My husband bought a $50 bag of beans last week because I let him pick, and that's what he ended up with. But it was humongous, so we're still on it. But I have a funny little story about Dr. Pepper because it kind of ties into my entire philosophy as a coach. So I was at a yoga teacher training workshop one weekend a million years ago, and we went on for a lunch break, and then we came back and I had a Dr. Pepper and a bag of chips or something with me, and some yogi next to me was like, "Oh, I'm surprised you drink that stuff." And I simply just shrugged it off and looked at her and I said, I'm not going to be grateful I counted calories my whole life. And that statement was one of the things that stuck with me forever because I'm not, and I don't think anybody is.
Yeah.
So yeah, enjoy the shit out of that Dr. Pepper.
I am I am super excited to try the 0 sugar Dr. Pepper because I recognize I just don't need the sugar in my life, but the caffeine and I don't know, it's just a good vibe in the morning.
You don't need that sugar because you're sweet enough.
Exactly. So much sweetness.
Yeah, I'm a Coke Zero person. Like that's my I don't want to say guilty pleasure, but that's my like thing I probably shouldn't be drinking, but I will anyways. But here we are getting sidetracked again, but that's my fault. Let's talk about let's get into today's conversation. So I've had more conversations. I've heard ADHD more in the last 3 months than I have since it had like a big, it was a big thing maybe like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know, something like that. And I think this is in adults and parents talking about their kids. So let's talk for a minute. Let's get into what impact you think COVID-19, the pandemic, has had on people and kids who maybe used to manage it, but can't anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like some of this is super even just personal to myself, plus what I've seen with clients. So I think one of the things that we really mess up about ADHD is that for a while, like educators held the standard for like, how do we diagnose? What do we look at for ADHD? And it was just looked at as like a disorder of focus and concentration, when the reality is like, it's such a holistic disorder. It impacts every part of your body. Sometimes it looks like anxiety, it looks like depression, it looks like so many other pieces that end up impacted, but sometimes we just have a conversation about focus. And so I think what ended up happening with the pandemic is that people that maybe were lower risk for ADHD, all of a sudden now we don't have our routines. We don't have like our setup standards, our coping skills that we used to have are all out the window. And so, yeah, but we still have to figure out how to produce, because that's what our whole system is set up about, is we still have to worry about productivity. We still have to worry about doing school in the middle of a global pandemic. Like all of those things were still expected, but now there's no coping, no routine. And ADHD is also a disorder that messes with dopamine. So dopamine is one of those really feel good, like satisfying hormones that if you're not getting enough, then it's really hard to keep moving. It's hard to focus when you can't get that satisfaction from completing a project. And so I think that's why it's coming up more, is because we removed all the things that people are excited about, all the things that were supposed to be really fun that you can go do. We can't do it on the weekends anymore. We can't go and run and do all of these traveling trips and things like that, the things that kind of sustain our dopamine throughout the year. Everything got locked down, but we were still expected to produce, kids and adults alike. And I think we just honestly tapped out everybody's reserve of dopamine.
Yeah. Oh my God, do I feel that? But so it sounds like you're saying that it was part environmental impact and part like chemical on a chemical level, like very way in there.
Yeah. And I think like you'll see that, I mean, you'll see that with other disorders as COVID has ravaged everybody, like anxiety, depression, all of the pieces. Extroverts, I feel like, have been destroyed through COVID because you can't connect with people in the same way. So there's just a lot of different ways that we're social creatures. We're meant to kind of connect with each other, and we're meant to kind of have routines, and all of that went out the door, but all the expectations stayed the same.
Mm-hmm. And over here, I'm like queen of introverts. So staying like inside my 20 square foot apartment for indefinite was like, all right, I'll be here if you need me. But I'm also a hugger. So I lost that sense of connection and that ability to produce dopamine. Last week, I opened up about, my mental health issues with anxiety and depression. And it was managing the serotonin to help with my depression, and then the dopamine receptors to manage my anxiety. So very similar circumstances that people have been depleted of their ability to chill and focus and just feel like themselves again. So let's go into a couple of like misconceptions around how you treat ADHD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think even just like what you just said highlights why it's harder sometimes for people with ADHD to get the correct treatment, because the medications that are typically used for adult ADHD, let's just talk about adult for a second versus kids, but the medications that are typically used for adult ADHD are stimulants. So they're controlled substances that you have to have, you can only get 30-day supplies. So as somebody with ADHD who forgets things all the live long day, it's a lot of planning, it's a lot of strategy, because you have to go through full testing before you can actually get on a medication, which is a little bit different than depression and anxiety. You can go in, describe your symptoms, get started on antidepressant, anti-anxiety medication rather quickly. With someone with ADHD, they might try those medications because it might look like depression or anxiety, particularly if they don't know what to look for. But it's going to be messing with the wrong hormone, or basically, yeah, the wrong hormone. So then you end up with people, particularly women, that have been on maybe antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications their whole life, and they felt like a little bit better, but they didn't feel totally okay. And they got this threshold where like, all right, well, this is just what it is now. It's just going to suck like this, but that's just life. And the reality is, people were messing with the wrong hormones. I didn't get diagnosed until this year. Like, I'd always kind of known I'd had some ADHD stuff going on, and the opinion that I had about medication was vastly different a year ago than it is today. And so I think that there's been lots of shifts, I think, for people realizing that maybe you don't have to just like tough it out. There are ways to cope with this that are healthier and better. But I think there's so much stigma around ADHD too.
Stigma around ADHD and stigma around medicating your problems away.
Exactly.
So what kind of doctor do you talk to be diagnosed with ADHD? Is because a lot of people, I feel like, will just go to their PCP and be like, I have these symptoms. And they're like, oh, you have this. And then it stops there. So is there somebody beyond that is more certified, licensed, knowledgeable?
Yeah, so I will even say, like, that's another piece that makes access to care a little bit tougher, is that when you're a kiddo, like, they can do it off of a couple different, you're going to hear my very loud son come in. Hello.
Okay. Morning, Milo.
Can you run back over there? That's Aunt Connie.
Mwah.
Go get Daddy. You're still on your appointment. That's my son. He is ADHD and autistic, so...
And the sweetest little thing.
A lot of other stuff there. He's also wearing his sister's lipstick this morning. But now I totally lost my train of thought. That's my ADHD moment.
That's okay. We were talking. You got it?
Doctors. Yep, doctors. So that's another reason that there's access to care issues a lot, is that you can't go to a PCP. They can't diagnose that, can't test for that. Your counselor usually cannot test for that unless you're working with a psychologist. But even then, they have to have that certification to get ADHD testing done. And so I would talk to either a psychologist or a psychiatrist. There are a lot of places that are popping up online that are saying, oh, we can give you your ADHD test for like $150. You'll be a licensed person and like all of the stuff. And it's honestly just preying on people that I think are really desperate. I think that eventually we'll get to that place, but right now there's a very strict like line of access in our country for how to receive those types of medications. So psychologist or psychiatrist for testing and diagnosis. Then you can take your testing to pretty much any doctor and they will prescribe the medication.
Yeah, I agree with that whole idea of like preying on people who just are begging for a solution. With Chris, my husband, being in marketing in Brightside, it's an online startup that combines talk therapy with medical intervention. So I meet with a psychiatrist. I'm a participant. I'm a patient, whatever, I'm paying customer, whatever you call it. But, there's a lot of competitors out there, and there has been research on some of these competitors that'll just say, like, take this test, we'll tell you what you need. And you could take the test 10 times in a row, put in different symptoms or whatever. And they're like, oh, you're severely depressed, come work with us. Or, oh, you have severe anxiety, because they want you to be a patient of theirs. So it's not always about the best price, and it's not always about just the first one that you find. You want to make sure that like the people that you're talking to actually know their shit.
Absolutely. And I will say too, like, people are catching up. So you might even go and talk to an established counselor in an office. And if they have not done their research on ADHD, they may not see it. They may say, oh, well, you can focus fine. Or, oh, you can have this conversation fine. You're coping fine. And I think that's the other thing that's super unfair about ADHD, is that people judge how well you're functioning based on how much you're producing. And the reality is, like, it's an emotional impact too. I can go to work every day, work all day, get all my paperwork in, get all the other stuff in. But what people don't see is then I come home and I have to crash on the couch. Like my kids don't get the best of me because I gave every ounce to making sure that everything was done at work. And then I come home and I'm just tapped, and like that wasn't going to work for me anymore. Like I couldn't do that anymore. And so I think a lot of people are white knuckling it, as I call it, to try to make it through with ADHD, because like, oh, it's not that bad. I can push myself to focus, but they don't see all the other ways that it takes away from your energy. It takes away from your ability to just move through the day and just be a human. You're just trying to produce at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Because like I say the exact same thing about diet and exercise. And for some people, diet and exercise intervention is the solution and that's all they need. And for some people, they tried, they feel like they are eating healthy, they're exercising every day, but they still feel like shit and they don't know why. And they still feel like they want to curl up on a ball on the couch and just like tune out from the world. And I'm definitely speaking from experience here. So yeah, I think we're in an age of empowering ourselves to question the medical professionals that we're seeking help from. And that's a really important thing to do, because I know you really want to just have the solution given to you, but it's not always the right one.
Yeah. And you really have to advocate. I have a client, and I can share this just because I have a client that went through 3 different places before, and she just knew something else was wrong. She knew something else was not right with her. And she was really thinking like, oh, you know what, this is probably bipolar. This is probably like something really serious. And after a conversation with her and just knowing what to look for, I was like, I think it might be ADHD, and like sent her to research and like understand exactly what it was, and then got her connected. And like now we have her on the right medication. That's the other thing, is like she had been telling herself for years it was her fault that the medications just weren't working the way they were supposed to. So sometimes you have to advocate, especially if you're a woman, especially if you're good at masking, especially if you're good at like multitasking and doing all the things. I think that there's the expectation like, okay, you're good. And so sometimes you don't see the need of how it hurts somebody internally.
Yeah. And so similarly, like if you've tried like medication and it hasn't worked, that isn't all medications. So we're kind of wandering into like the next question, which we've touched on a little bit, is the pros and cons of medicating. And it's not an exact science, right? Like it's not, and that's not what people want to hear, because they just want to take a pill and be better. But there's a adjustment period, and talking with your psychiatrist or whoever you're working with and making sure. So like, are there any other pros or cons for taking medications that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, I mean, I even just to talk about how much my opinions about medication have shifted in this last year, it is crazy. Like, so like I've always very much supported like mental health medications. I'm a social worker, like I do counseling. Obviously, I've always supported medications. But when it came to kids, I have always kind of felt like, you know what, maybe we should be messing with brain chemistry until they get to a place where we know exactly what's going to happen. Maybe we shouldn't be like fiddling around with that. But I have a 9-year-old, and she is almost the exact opposite of me. She is a pure extrovert, always wants to be going, always wants to be around other people. And COVID was really hard on her, and she was starting to get really depressed, really anxious, having meltdowns more frequently, not as interested in doing the things that she really wanted to, just wanted to snack all of the time. And we tried to kind of work around a couple other things, like try to treat it as if it was just depression, try to treat it as if it was just anxiety. But the reality is like she wasn't getting enough dopamine. And so no matter how much like we tried to manage the depression, the anxiety, her brain just does not synthesize dopamine in the way that a neurotypical person does. And I just seeing her struggling as much as she was just kind of broke me a little bit. And then I finally realized like, okay, this medication, even though there's a ton of stigma around it, is what actually helps my daughter's brain create feel-good hormones. And it was almost like a light switch. So we decided finally, after like a year of trying non-stimulant medications, we tried a stimulant, and it was almost like a light bulb went off for her. Just kind of seeing the shift in her emotionally in one day was insane. And that's the other thing about ADHD meds. I know that someone had kind of questioned like, what if my kid doesn't want to take them? What if we don't want to try this trial and error? The difference between ADHD meds and depression medication is like with an ADHD med, you're going to know that day if that medication is going to work for you or not. It's not a 4 to 6 week like buildup that you get with other medications. It is, you're going to know that day. Milo's coming back. Thank you, Nugget. So I think that's the other part to it, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be as much trial and error. Now we do kind of have to tweak like dosages, and sometimes certain stimulants don't work with other people, but you have that instant reaction instead of waiting 4 to 6 weeks, which is exhausting sometimes.
Wow.
So that's I kind of call that like, that's our karma. It takes so long to get to the point where you actually can try a medication, and you have to work so hard like to get all of the things boxes checked, that when you do finally get to take a medication, you get to know pretty quickly if this is going to be the right fit for me. So that's kind of like the stimulant piece. With the non-stimulant piece, there's a lot of really good medications out there, especially for kids. If you're not wanting to start with stimulants, which we didn't start with stimulants with our daughter. That's where we went. I don't think we would have gone there if it hadn't been for COVID. Because one of the things that I watch for kids, and now even watching with adults, is that someone might be able to focus for a short period of time. I'm less concerned with their focus. I'm more concerned with their confidence, with their depression, with their anxiety, with their self-talk, those things. Like, I don't want to see that impacted by ADHD. Focusing is what the systems need us to do in order to like act at school. Like, they need us to be able to sit still for 7 to 8 hours. Like, that's a lot. Like, obviously my kids are in public school, like they experience like that regular day-to-day activity, but like it's a lot to expect of a child, especially a child with ADHD. So I've got to say, like, I'm not totally invested in like just medicating kids. I'm not invested at all in medicating kids to make sure they can behave or that they can be focused. But I don't want them to lose ground emotionally because they're not creating that dopamine.
That's a really important point, to not just want them to sit still and chill the F out.
Yeah.
Because when we're exhausted and drained, that's, like, please just, what if you were quiet for 5 minutes? But to understand that like their ability to generate dopamine and create emotions is such a critical part of their healthy brain development and their social development and just overall. So is ADHD medication designed to be taken for life, or is it the kind of thing where you can taper as needed, or do they not know?
Yeah, so it depends on which medication. And I would say like stimulants can be either for life or they can be as needed kind of things, depending on how well you're doing. I would say like, I don't plan on being on stimulants my whole life. I just recognize that like right now, it was the only way that I was going to be able to manage my emotions, to be able to manage like how, like the depression and anxiety component of things. Also, as somebody takes it more long term, they do tend to wear, like their effectiveness gets lower. So it's not really a medication that will work for somebody to take every day for the rest of their life. But that being said, most people that do have ADHD don't want to take their meds every day because it helps me feel better, but it also like masks a couple of like my personality pieces. Like, I'm kind of a weirdo and I'm a little quirky. And a lot of times when I have that medication, like I am like on, like I'm tuned in, I'm doing whatever I'm supposed to be doing. I can get so much done. Like, it's crazy how much I can get done. And yet like some of the weird parts of me are a little bit more like masked because that medication is there. And so like a lot of people don't want to take it every day because they don't totally feel like themselves every day. But also like that balance of having good days and bad days helps, I think. Does that answer that a little bit?
Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to recognize too. If you do start like your kid on a medication and then they're acting differently and you're like, that's not my baby. I know they're not like that, but it's a bit of a trade-off, you'd say?
Yeah, a little bit. Like, I would say when Penny started the stimulants, I feel like I got my kid back, but that's because like we didn't start her on stimulants until like I was seeing some of the other things like depression, anxiety parts of ADHD. But I would say like if she's having a really good day and she's on the medication, she's quieter than she normally is. And like on one hand, I'm like, oh yes, like she's quieter. But on the other hand, like that's not Penelope. And so like I can tell that maybe that was a day that maybe she didn't need the medication as much if she is being like that much squelched. That's the only word I can think of.
Yeah. And I think we could talk probably for a really long time about this, because I'd be interested in exploring a little bit of like understanding what your identity is and who's to say like you're not more you on a medication versus not being on a medication, and kind of detaching what you thought your kid was before they were on something or before they got intervention of any kind, and really thinking about like whether they're medicated or not, like if they're improving, I don't know, like finding different measurements of like contentment with yourself if this is you, or with your kids.
Yeah, I think as adults, our focus is what maybe drives us a little bit more, because we have to be in a workplace where we're marked in that way. But like as kids, it gets frustrating when your friends are telling you like you're being too loud or you're being too much, or when you're super excited about a subject and so you're talking about it for like 20 minutes and people have like glazed over. So sometimes like for kids, it messes with their confidence. It messes with their picture of self-esteem. And so giving Penny, my daughter, those tools has let her feel more confident, because she can focus and she can kind of censor it. So even though I see her sometimes as quieter, she sees herself as being more in control of her body, which a lot of times she really gets frustrated with.
Yeah. And this kind of, so before I ask the next question or continue the conversation, if anyone who's watching this live or on a replay, please, if you have questions or thoughts or want to interject or say anything, like put it in the comments and we'll try to get to them now, or Emily's in the group and she can definitely address them at a later time. So one of the moms who asked if we could answer a few questions on this talk is how to have a discussion with your kid about ADHD as a diagnosis for them without making them feel like there's something wrong with them.
Yeah. So I am in love with the movement that's happening around neurodivergence. So that's even a word that hasn't become super popular outside of like neurodivergent families.
Yeah, explain.
Yeah, so it's kind of become more popular around families and around people that have struggled with like ADHD, autism spectrum type stuff, sensory processing, things where our brains just work a little bit differently. It doesn't necessarily impede the way that we're able to process it, just we process things differently. And so there's an entire movement around the fact that just because we're not neurotypical doesn't mean that we're broken or wrong or off in some way. And I think ADHD is another one that has so much stigma attached to it that people are embarrassed sometimes to say like, oh no, I really am diagnosed with ADHD. Because when we were growing up, it was kind of like, okay, if you had that label, then you probably were not going to be in all the same classes, or you were going to struggle with some of these pieces. And now we realize that a lot of people with ADHD got missed because they were able to function, but they weren't necessarily getting everything they needed. Because from the school's perspective, like if somebody is functioning and doing their classwork, that's what they want to see. Like that's their biggest investment, is that if the kid can do the work and they're doing the work well, then that nothing else really matters outside of the school system. Not teachers, I'm not saying that about teachers, I love teachers, but sometimes like the way that they do testing and like IEPs and 504s and all of those pieces are around like the kid's ability to perform. And that's another reason why I really encourage people, like don't just go off of what the school is saying, because if your kid can perform, they're not going to have any recommendations for you. They're going to say, no, everything is fine. Everything's totally fine. But you can see your kid from another perspective and be like, yeah, they can do the work, but they're not okay. So back to the other question of how do you help a kid that's really struggling is even with my own daughter, she really was embarrassed about the idea of ADHD. She felt like it was something that she had to struggle with that made her different. We've had conversations about like, I just want to be normal. I just want to be the same. And I think I probably struggled with that myself growing up, because I've always been a little strange. And I think with that, I'm almost glad that I didn't find out until later when I had a better picture of who I was as a person. Because I think if I had found out when I was my daughter's age, I would have really struggled with that. I probably would have really wanted to hide a lot of those things because there's so much stigma. And so I really look at neurodivergence and some of the superpowers that ADHD people have, or even autism spectrum people have. And honestly, this is going to sound like the cheesiest thing ever, but I love the TikTok community. Kind of obsessed with it because it connects so many people in really healthy ways instead of the way that like feels off. And so there's some really cool things that you can do with your ADHD brain that neurotypical people can't do. Like I've seen some of these memes of like, what do you mean you don't have music playing in your brain all the time? And like not realizing that that wasn't a thing that other people do or have, or that you have conversations with yourself in your brain and like you're thinking about 20 different things, or you're like replaying a movie in your head because you're bored in class. Like I just thought everybody did that. I thought that was totally normal. Because why wouldn't I think that was not like that's just and so I think there's some really cool things from neurodivergent people, and there's a whole community of people that now identify as neurodivergent that makes it feel a little bit cooler and a little bit less like a burden and something you have to hide.
Yeah, I was, since I work in the online space, like I've been having more and more conversations around the idea that, or the fact that like TikTok is a very, very positive place. And like, they make sure it stays that way. Like if you are negative, if you're bullying, if you drop, like, I don't even know if you're allowed to say the F word on there. They'll kick you out. And I like absolutely love that. And you mentioned like the idea of not just saying like, oh, well, there's other people with ADHD or this isn't a bad thing, but showing people that there are skills, abilities, really special things about them. Because we want to be normal and fit in. Like I still want to be able to go to a party at my age and not be like the center of attention weirdo. So being able to fit in a way that just explores the idea that everybody has a particular set of skills, a uniqueness about them, and whether it has a label or not is irrelevant.
Yeah. And I think too, like even just tapping into some of those like superhero kind of things that you can do, like ADHD people are known problem solvers. Like you can look at things from multiple different directions. A lot of times people with ADHD have stronger senses of justice. I don't know what that's about, but I just know that it's there. And I don't know if it's because like the way that people process things, but like my daughter is super justice oriented. I am too, but I wonder sometimes if that might even be some spectrum stuff. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of really cool things. And there's a lot of like, honestly, Google searches of neurodivergence. There's tons and tons and tons of books. I can give resources for pretty much all age groups and genders around leaning into neurodivergence instead of the ADHD like diagnosis and label. One of the things I think we're going to end up seeing come out of this is we're starting to develop and look at more like clinical research and things like that. I think we're going to end up seeing that ADHD ends up having a name change at some point because attention deficit and concentration deficit and hyperactivity and disorder and all of those pieces that have been attached around this, like we've already changed some of it. It used to be you could have one type or the other. And now they're kind of changing that to where like, no, it's just this, it's just ADHD. And I think once we break it down a little bit further, they're going to realize that, okay, there's a whole lot of symptoms that go along with this. We just saw the focus concentration one. And I think it's going to end up with some different things going on clinically, like from diagnostics perspective.
Yeah, so I think, we're talking about the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on people's responding. Like there's some negative elements to it, but whenever a big significant thing happens in a particular, section of science or, whatever, like we're forced to start paying attention to it. And we're like, well, wait, that's a thing. Let's explore this. And so something, I don't want to say good necessarily, but maybe we can say that a good thing is that we're starting to pay more attention to it and get people the help that they really need, the right kind of help.
I absolutely like wholeheartedly agree with that. And I will even say like, particularly for women, there are women that have been diagnosed with bipolar, borderline personality disorder, depression, anxiety, PTSD, all kinds of things that actually now we're realizing maybe it was ADHD. Like they've been on depression, anxiety medication since they were a teenager. They've struggled with depression most of their life. And now we're realizing was ADHD. And so I think some of that is, I don't know if we would have realized that that many women had not been caught if there hadn't have been the impact on women from COVID-19, because I think women have kind of carried a brunt of a lot of things. They've left the workforce in bigger numbers than ever before, because who's going to stay with their kids? Who's going to take care of their kids? They have had to change jobs. They've had to work from home. Like there's been lots and lots of pieces where like traditionally women weren't acknowledged as much as having ADHD or spectrum disorders. And now they're getting diagnosed. And it's, I think there's going to be like, honestly, there's a whole nother generation of people that got missed that now it's going to look different on the other side of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk about completely losing a whole part of your identity and your ability to be creative and to, use this part of your brain when you're constantly now in a state of reactivity and stress response for all of the reasons of the last year. And I think the last thing that I want to kind of like segue to is, the correlation between food and our kids' ability to focus, or adults. Like, is there a dietary connection with, behaviors within the realm of like ADHD?
Yeah, so I know that you and I have talked about this before, but just going into it, so it's kind of like a weird, it impacts it on both sides of it. So it's interesting because eating is one of the quickest ways to increase dopamine. So when we talk about like being an emotional eater, yeah, because it increases dopamine. And so then we end up with people that like, if somebody's not getting enough dopamine and craving sugary foods and things like that, then that's what's kind of stimulating them if they're not on a stimulant, for example. And so there's that craving now for snacking on all the junk food because that's what's going to make me the happiest as quick as I possibly can. So like this was another thing that I kind of went through with my daughter, is that hiding snacks in her room and like just snacking non-stop this past year. And she was just trying to get her dopamine up. Like sis was just trying to get some sort of stimulation from being bored and like raising that dopamine level. And so that's one of the ways that like binge eating disorders can be really connected with ADHD, because they're still about trying to stimulate that dopamine. So that's one component of it. Another component of it is on some of the medications, they act as appetite suppressants. And so for some people, they will start to lose a lot of weight when they start an ADHD medication. And sometimes people are like, oh, this is amazing, this is wonderful, but you're not actually getting the nutrition that you need. So like when you start a stimulant, they talk about the fact that like you really need to be pushing proteins hard to make sure that you actually have enough energy to keep going the way that you want to with ADHD meds, because you could be hyper focused and be like, I'm going to do this. The other night I decided to rearrange my entire bedroom, but I hadn't eaten anything. And so like I started to get sick and started to feel well and like get really tired. And it was because like I just had not stopped to think about eating. And so ADHD has a really tight connection with food and with diet. The other thing too is like consistency. ADHD is a disorder that messes with your consistency. So I can have great plans to go to the gym and go work out, and I'm going to do this routine and I'm going to do this. And then ADHD says, we're bored with this. Like, we're not doing this anymore. And so it's really hard for people to start into new routines when they struggle with ADHD, because sometimes like I have to remember that like, oh yeah, like you haven't put on makeup today, or oh yeah, like you left this piece here. So it's hard sometimes to even keep track of everything, let alone start a new routine. So ADHD can definitely mess with people that really struggle with consistency. And when you're not getting enough dopamine, you crave sugary, high fat foods, because that's going to be the quickest way to get dopamine to you. So there is a lot of research behind like, well, should you limit your kids having sugar? Does that help them with focus? Does that help them with those other pieces? And I would say it's a mixed bag, because just like as an alternate way of treating a child, just changing the child's diet probably is not going to mess with that ADHD component the way that people I think would hope. I wish it were that way too. I really do. I struggled a lot with medicating my daughter. But after working in the schools and after seeing what some of these kids really struggle with, after being with my own daughter, with realizing and finally being introspective enough to recognize what my patterns looked like, restricting isn't going to do it. And we've talked about this before, like just restricting yourself is going to make things worse, especially for somebody with ADHD, because then like you start thinking the only way I'm going to be happy is if I get that like bag of chips, or I need that Dr. Pepper at 3 p.m. because that's the only way I'm going to keep going. And I think a lot of people that talk about food like that don't realize that, okay, but what are you stimulating? What is the food actually giving you? And for a lot of people, it's dopamine.
Mm-hmm. And as far as like managing kids, we could be really messing with them if they are reaching for particular foods to generate that dopamine, if that's all they know. And then we read some wonky ass article in Women's Health that suggests that a gluten-free diet might help symptoms of ADHD. So then all of a sudden you're like, no more pasta for you, no more bread for you. We're doing this, this, and this. So you're taking away literally the only last thing that they have to hold on to.
Yeah, which is so hard because like obviously I don't want my kid to just like eat chocolate all day, but also like I recognize now looking back when I was getting frustrated with her, she wasn't like excited about it. She just was trying to make it through a day. And so I would say like we do limit the amount of treats that we bring into the house. Just because like when they're gone, they're gone. Because the other thing is like ADHD is you're always gonna struggle with impulsivity. And so if it's here, like they're going to seek it out. So we have snacks, but also like we are starting to put routines in of like, but if you eat all of them at one time, you're not going to have them for later. And so you do still want your kids to build in those like coping skills, but yeah, cutting out everything that's like yummy just makes me sad. Like that makes me so sad. Like the idea of giving up, like I obviously have cupcake obsession or like Dr. Pepper, like the idea of giving up some of those things at times felt like, nope, this is the last thing that I'm holding on to make it through COVID. I'm not giving this up. Like I'm not worrying about weight during COVID. And so I think like that's been a hard thing too, of having like that idea that food is your lifeline if you're not getting the right stimulant or the right medication.
Yeah, 100%. So the show's supposed to be a half an hour, but I feel like we could talk all day about this.
Oh my gosh, I didn't realize how late we were going. I just talk. I'm sorry, guys.
It's no. This is a great, I mean, I feel like this is a really important conversation and we might have to just have a part 2, but to kind of just wrap things up for today's episode, what is one action step? Let's say a mom is watching this and they hear all these things and they're like, oh my God, that sounds like me. Do I have ADHD? So what's one action step a mom who's listening can take today to start implementing some of the things we talked about?
Yeah, so a couple things. I'll give you like a handful of, I know I'm supposed to do one, but I can't do one because everybody has different ways of approaching it. So what I would say is like when you do your research, when you're doing your Googling, make sure that you're putting ADHD in women because it's a totally different symptom group. It's it's going to look totally different than it does for men. And honestly, most of the clinical stuff has been written for men. So make sure that when you're doing your searching, like do ADHD in women, it's going to bring up different symptoms, different things like that. If you start to really feel like some of those things are connecting and they make sense to you and you've tried other things and it's just not working, then I would really suggest that you think about getting an ADHD assessment or working with a counselor. So in that way, like I'm not totally 100% sure about like resources in New York. That might be something we have to kind of like do a review and then I can be like, oh, this one looks legit, this one looks scary, and kind of see like what's going to work there. But I also think you have to know what's going on in your own body. And sometimes that means even if it feels weird, and I know it feels weird because if you're in your 30s or your 40s and you're like, hey, I'm just thinking this for the first time, like no one's going to believe me. Like people are going to think that I'm just trying to be trendy now because ADHD is what we're talking about. And I would say like, don't worry about anyone thinking that you're going to be trendy or that anyone's going to think that like you're just making all of this up. Like this is about your health. In the same way that you would advocate if you were having like some sort of other major crisis, sometimes we have to fight a little bit harder for health. And so if you feel like it's connecting, if you feel like it's making sense when you start to do your research, you shouldn't wait. You should just go do it right now because you've been waiting for a long time already.
Yeah. And as far as like wondering where to turn to or reach out, like this group, the Strong as a Mother, Happy, Healthy Living group, is a completely judgment-free, safe space to ask these questions. And even if you're not 100% comfortable posting publicly, please message me privately or use the anonymous post, because I am certain that some of your questions are also questions that other moms might have. And we are happy to explore these conversations with you and help guide you to the help that you guys really need, because I might be a fitness coach, I might be a healthy habits coach, but I'm not the solution to everyone's problems. So if the best thing I could do is help facilitate a solution for all of you guys, then I feel like I've done my job. So thank you so much, Emily. Like, I love you so much, first of all, cousin. And what I want to do here is I'd love to keep this conversation going. So moms, if you have thoughts, if you have, ideas, suggestions, anything that you want to bring up about this conversation, please put it in the comments, please message, reach out to us. Maybe Emily will come back again as a recurring star in our little talk show here. If you'd like to connect with her, she's happy to receive your messages in Messenger. So if you're in this group, thank you so much for spending your time here. If you are watching this replay, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe, so I know that you want to keep having these kinds of conversations with me. And make sure you join the Strong as a Mother online community, because to live a healthy and happy life as moms on the journey through motherhood, it takes a village. Come and join ours. I cannot wait to meet you. So until next week, stay strong, stay caffeinated. Cheers, my amazing cousin. And I will see you all in the group. Bye, everyone.